Human beings do not carve stone like this by accident. They do not gather massive pillars, shape them with deliberate symmetry, raise them into precise geometric relationships, and decorate them with symbols drawn from a shared cosmology simply to pass time. Such acts require more than survival. They require memory. Memory of how things were done before. Memory of cooperation, of shared intention, of labor divided and knowledge accumulated. They require culture that has already learned how to endure. And that is what makes this place unsettling. Because everything about it suggests that it was built not at the beginning of civilization, but after something had already ended. The builders were not experimenting. They were remembering. They came together with purpose, erecting stone in arrangements that speak of planning measured not in days or seasons, but in generations. Each pillar implies instruction passed from elder to youth. Each carving reflects symbols already understood by those who saw them. Nothing here feels improvised. Nothing here feels naive. This was not the birthplace of civilization. It was a sanctuary for survivors. The location itself tells the story quietly, without myth or poetry. Not in a fertile valley where crops would one day be planted. Not beside a river that would later feed cities and empires. But on high ground. A hilltop with wide sightlines across the surrounding land. A place above the floodline. A place where rising water could not reach. A place where the horizon could be watched. A place where the earth, after chaos, finally felt stable again. For centuries, perhaps longer, people came here not to live, but to gather. There are no signs of daily life. No hearts blackened by cooking fires. No refuse pits filled with the debris of ordinary existence. No permanent dwellings. This was not a village. It was not a town. It was not a city. It was a place of remembrance. People came to stand among the stones, to repeat rituals whose meanings had already begun to fade, to honor something they had survived but could never fully explain. They came to mark time not by harvests, but by memory. They came because the world had once ended, and this was where survival began again. And then, after centuries of gathering, they did something extraordinary. They buried it, not in abandonment, not in neglect, but deliberately. The enclosures were filled carefully. The pillars were protected, not broken. The carvings were sealed beneath layers of earth and stone, as if whoever performed this act wanted them preserved, not erased. This was not destruction. It was closure, or perhaps preservation. Why build something so monumental only to hide it? Why invest generations of labor into a site meant never to be seen again? Perhaps because the knowledge encoded here was dangerous. Warnings about a sky that could burn, waters that could rise without mercy, cycles of destruction that no ritual could stop. Perhaps because the rituals no longer worked. Once agriculture transformed humanity's relationship with the land. Or perhaps because grief, when carried too long, becomes a burden rather than a lesson. Or perhaps they buried it for us, for a future humanity that would dig deep enough to find it. A humanity that would once again face planetary change. A humanity that would need to remember that apocalypse is not extinction, that survival is possible. This place stands as humanity's first archive, not a library of words, but of stone and symbol. A record written by those who lived through the end of their world, and refused to let memory disappear with it. The stones do not speak loudly, they whisper. They whisper of fire in the sky, of water that rose faster than anyone expected, of coastlines swallowed, of animals disappearing, of people gathering whatever knowledge they could carry and moving toward higher ground. And that whisper does not end here, because across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, the same memory emerges again and again. In Mesopotamia, the oldest written epic tells of the flood sent to cleanse the world, a warning given in secret, a vessel sealed with pitch, animals gathered, waters rising until even mountains vanish, a boat coming to rest on high ground. In Greece, the story changes names but not structure. Divine judgment, a chest carried by water, 9 days adrift, a mountain refuge, humanity reborn from stone and earth. In India, a speaking fish warns of a coming deluge, a boat tied to a divine guide, waters swallowing the world, survival on a mountain peak, ritual, rebirth. In the Americas, worlds destroyed and recreated, a flood ending an age, a culture hero emerging afterward to teach agriculture, astronomy, and law, civilization rebuilt by survivors guided by memory. In the Andes, waters rising to the mountain tops, humanity remade from stone, a god walking among survivors, teaching them how to live again before departing across the sea. In China, floods that threaten to erase the world until they are finally tamed. In the north, a deluge survived by hiding within the world tree. In Australia, stories of drowned coastlines remembered so accurately that modern maps confirm them. These are not coincidences, they are testimony. Modern science once dismissed oral tradition as unreliable, as stories distorted by time. But evidence now shows that human memory, when encoded in ritual and story, can preserve factual information for 10,000 years or more. Coastlines remembered long after they vanished. Land bridges named after they drowned. Hunting grounds recalled beneath modern seas. If geography can be preserved in story for 10 millennia, then catastrophe can too. The flood myths are not inventions. They are memories translated into myths so they could survive when nothing else did. They tell us the same thing in different languages. The world ended. We survived. Everything had to begin again. The catastrophe was global. Ice returned. Megafloods carved continents. Sea levels rose and erased coastlines everywhere. Humanity did not imagine this. Humanity endured it. And the evidence remains. In scarred landscapes that never healed. In submerged valleys beneath modern seas. In ice cores preserving chemical signatures of sudden change. In stories repeated for 500 generations. The flood was not a metaphor. It was a lived experience. And today, quietly, without drama, the rhythm begins to repeat. Ice melts, seas rise, coastlines retreat, cities sink, communities move inland. The pace is slower, the mechanisms are different, but the direction is the same. Water does not forget. The survivors of the ancient catastrophe tried to tell us this. They carved their warning into stone. They encoded it into myth. They trusted memory more than monuments. And now, thousands of years later, we are finally learning to listen. The stones are patient, the sea is patient, and history is never finished. Sleep now, knowing this. The world has ended before. Humanity survived. Memory endured. And water, in the end, always remembers. The problem with catastrophe is that it rarely leaves a single clean signature. It arrives as a chain, a cascade. One threshold crossed, then another, and another. Until the world that existed yesterday no longer matches the world that exists today. When we imagine the flood, we picture water rising like a simple line on a wall. But the past does not move in straight lines. It moves in pulses, in sudden releases, in accelerations that feel impossible until they are already happening. And when the old world began to fail, it did not fail politely. The sky did not announce its intentions. The oceans did not ask permission. Ice did not negotiate. There are moments in the record thin layers in sediment, abrupt shifts in chemistry, strange sud-like horizons where time compresses, where centuries behave like seasons, and seasons behave like days. You can look at it in a lab, under sterile light, and still feel something ancient in your spine. A quiet recognition that nature can change its mind quickly. This is what survivors would have learned first. That stability is a story we tell ourselves. For thousands of years before the catastrophe, human beings lived in a world that felt permanent. The coastlines were familiar. The rivers ran in remembered channels. The animals moved through seasonal paths that elders could predict. A child could grow into adulthood seeing the same hills, the same shores, the same hunting grounds that their parents had known. And then, slowly at first, the world began to drift. The cold that had ruled for millennia began to loosen. Ice sheets that seemed eternal began to retreat. The seas, patient and heavy, began to rise. A few inches here, a few inches there. Not enough to terrify, only enough to confuse. The shore moved strangely. Salt crept into wells. Storms reached farther inland. The old markers no longer matched the tide. In such times, people do what people always do. They adapt quietly. They move camp a little higher. They change routes. They tell themselves it will settle. But then the pulses came. The kind of pulses that do not feel like change. They feel like betrayal. Imagine an ice dam holding back a lake larger than some seas. Imagine that dam weakening as the climate shifts. Imagine, suddenly, the failure. A wall of water escaping not as a river, but as a continent-wide force. An unthinkable volume moving with the logic of gravity and nothing else. It does not come as a wave you can outrun. It comes as a moving geography. It scours rock. It tears soil down to bone. It carries boulders like toys. It rearranges landscapes so violently that, thousands of years later, the scars still look fresh. This is the kind of water that turns valleys into channels and channels into wastelands. The kind of water that leaves dry falls, abandoned cliffs where water once roared with a force that no modern river can replicate. The kind of water that makes a person understand, in one day, that the earth is not a home, but a body, and bodies can be wounded. Now imagine living near the coast as the seas rise in long, relentless quiet. Not one surge, but a slow drowning of the familiar world. The places where your ancestors buried their dead, the coves where children learned to fish, the flat lands where wild grains once grew, where animals gathered, where people first learned the comfort of returning to a known place. Those places would have vanished first, and when they vanished, they would not have vanished with drama. They would have slipped under the water like sleep, a little more gone each season, until one morning you look out and the land is simply not there. Where the shore used to be is now a shallow sea. Where your paths used to run is now a moving surface that hides everything beneath it. And the mind does something strange when confronted with loss that cannot be fought. It turns loss into story, because a story can hold what the hands cannot. This is how memory becomes myth, not through invention, but through compression, through translation, through the need to carry an experience across generations without losing its warning. The world ended in water. We survived. We began again. There is a reason the survivor's refuge is almost always a mountain. Not because mountains are romantic, but because, in a flood, altitude is truth. A mountain does not care what you believe. It only offers height. When the sea rises, when rivers swell beyond their banks, when storms push water inland, the first thought becomes simple: higher ground. And so you can imagine the movement. Families carrying what they can. Groups splitting and reforming. People traveling paths they have never traveled, driven by a pressure behind them that cannot be negotiated with. The floodline becomes the border between past and future. Below it, drowned memory. Above it, fragile survival. It is in this context that the hilltop sanctuary begins to make perfect sense. Not as a settlement, but as a gathering place. Not as a home, but as a threshold. A place where survivors could see the surrounding land and, for the first time in years, trust that the ground beneath their feet would remain ground. And what do survivors do once immediate danger passes? They account for what was lost. They tell the story until it becomes stable enough to hold. They repeat it until it becomes structure. They encode it into ritual so that it will not dissolve. Because the most terrifying part of catastrophe is not the moment of danger. It is the moment afterward, when the world is quiet again, and you realize how easily the world can change. That realization is not something you want a child to forget. So you build memory into stone. Stone outlasts mood. Stone outlasts politics. Stone outlasts the individual. When you carve an animal into a pillar, you are not decorating. You are naming forces. You are saying, this mattered. This watched us. This fed us. This vanished. This survived. And when you carve a serpent, or a scorpion, or a vulture, you are not just drawing nature. You are drawing symbols of threat, of death, of transformation, images that can carry the weight of trauma without requiring explanation. Because explanation changes with generations. Symbol persists. This is the quiet genius of such monuments. They do not need literacy. They do not need a single language. They do not even need the builders to be remembered as individuals. They need only one thing: that people continue to return. And return they did, season after season, generation after generation. Not to live, but to participate. Not to farm, but to remember. There is a kind of grief that cannot be processed privately. It needs community. It needs shared acknowledgement. It needs something larger than the individual to hold it. Perhaps this is why these enclosures feel like theaters of memory. Circular, communal, inward-facing, not a place of production, but of meaning. If the old world drowned, then something had to replace it, and this replacement would not happen immediately. After catastrophe, humanity does not step cleanly into progress. It fragments. Some groups would have turned inland and become nomadic again, distrustful of coasts and rivers that could betray. Some would have followed receding shorelines, learning to hunt in new wetlands where old plains had been. Some would have clung to high valleys and plateaus, building new patterns of life in landscapes that felt safer. And some, perhaps the most burdened with memory, would have tried to preserve knowledge that could vanish. Knowledge of stonework, knowledge of planning, knowledge of communal organization, knowledge of the sky, because the sky, too, may have changed. In many flood traditions, the water is only half the story. The other half is fire, noise, darkness, a sense that the heavens themselves became dangerous. Whether this points to comet fragments, atmospheric events, volcanic winters, or something else, the emotional core remains consistent. The catastrophe was not merely local weather. It felt cosmic. If your elders believed the sky burned, you would treat the sky with reverence and fear. You would watch it closely. You would mark its cycles. You would align your gathering places with its movements, not because you worship astronomy, but because you need predictability. and the stars are the oldest predictable things we have. This is another reason hilltops matter. They give you horizon. They give you sky. From a hilltop, you can see dawn approaching. You can watch storms form. You can observe the stars without obstruction. And if you have survived a world-ending event, you do not take horizon for granted. So the sanctuary becomes not only a memorial, but an observatory of meaning. A place where the survivors could rehearse their relationship with time itself. And then comes the most enigmatic act of all: burial. The deliberate sealing of the monument beneath her. We often treat burial as forgetting, but burial can be the opposite. A burial can be a promise. To bury something carefully is to protect it from weather, from vandalism, from the slow erosion of centuries. It is to place it into the care of the ground, to let soil become a vault. Why would survivors need a vault? Because memory can become dangerous if held too openly. If a community is constantly reenacting catastrophe, it may become unable to adapt to the new world. It may become obsessed with what was lost and blind to what can be built. At some point, the survivors' descendants might have faced a choice: continue living in the shadow of the flood, or step into the new age. And perhaps the burial was that step, not denying the past, not destroying it, but placing it away, like a sacred object wrapped in cloth, stored for a future generation that might need it again. In that interpretation, burial is not a conclusion. It is a time capsule, a message written not for the next season, but for the distant future. And this is where the story becomes quietly intimate. Because we are the distant future, we are the generation that learned to dig deep enough. We stand in a world built along coastlines again, just as the ancient survivors eventually did. We build cities beside oceans because we believe we understand the sea. We measure it, map it, predict it. We set our confidence into concrete and steel. And yet, the same old rhythm returns. Ice melts, sea rises, storms intensify. Communities begin to retreat. The mechanisms are different. The triggers are different. But the human experience begins to rhyme. The feeling of watching a boundary move. The feeling of losing familiar land. The feeling of deciding which memories can be carried and which must be surrendered to water. This is what the ancient sanctuary whispers across millennia. Not that the past was better, not that disaster is inevitable, but that catastrophe is survivable and survivable things can be prepared for, if we are willing to remember. And perhaps that is the real reason flood myths never release their hold on the human mind, because they are not simply stories of destruction. They are stories of endurance. They say, in 100 languages, the same quiet sentence: we lived through it, and you can too. The question is not whether water can rise. Water has always been able to rise. The question is whether a civilization can rise with it. Whether we can move, adapt, rebuild, without losing what makes us human. Whether we can preserve knowledge and compassion through upheaval. Whether we can treat memory as guidance rather than paralysis. The ancient builders chose stone because stone outlasts individuals. They chose symbols because symbols outlast language. They chose high ground because high ground outlasts floods. And then they buried it, trusting that time itself would one day reveal it again. Not as entertainment, as testimony. So when you listen to this story, when your mind grows heavy and sleep draws close, let the pace slow. Let the images soften. Imagine the hilltop in quiet dawn. The stones standing like silent figures. The wind moving through grass. No city noise. No engines. Only sky, horizon, earth. Imagine survivors gathering without speaking loudly, as if sound might awaken something. Imagine their hands touching carved stone, feeling grooves made by ancestors whose names are gone but whose intention remains. Imagine them looking outward, across a land still healing, and realizing that the world can be rebuilt not exactly as it was, but enough. And imagine, finally, the act of burial. Soil poured gently, stone covered carefully, a monument hidden with reverence, not shame. A farewell that is also a message. We are not the first to face the sea. We are not the first to watch the world change. And if we are wise, we will not be the first to forget. Sleep well. Let the story settle into you like sediment, layer by layer, calm and heavy. And when you wake, remember this: the sea is patient, and the earth is old. But human beings are capable of carrying memory farther than any flood can reach. Time does not erase catastrophe. It rearranges it. What once felt like terror becomes background. What once demanded constant vigilance slowly dissolves into habit, into architecture, into the way societies choose where to settle and where never to return. The flood did not remain visible on the surface of memory, but it sank deeper, becoming instinct rather than narrative, shaping decisions long after its details blurred. After the waters receded and the land found a new equilibrium, humanity entered a long interval that history rarely describes accurately. It was not an age of ignorance, and it was not an age of enlightenment. It was an age of restraint, an age shaped by the quiet understanding that the world could change suddenly and without warning. People learned not to trust the ground completely. They learned not to assume that permanence was guaranteed. They learned to value mobility, redundancy, and memory. The first generations after the catastrophe did not rush to rebuild the world that had been lost. They did not recreate the drowned coastlines or attempt to reclaim the submerged plains. Those places were remembered, but they were also feared. Water had claimed them once, and nothing suggested it could not do so again. Instead, survivors adapted to what remained. They moved inland. They gathered on plateaus and high valleys. They followed animals that had also adapted, learning new migration routes and new rhythms of survival. Their lives became quieter, smaller, more careful. This period leaves few monuments because monuments are declarations of confidence, and confidence takes time to return. Yet even in this restraint, something important was happening. Knowledge was being sorted. Not all knowledge survives catastrophe equally. Some skills become irrelevant, others become essential. The survivors learn which forms of understanding were worth carrying forward. Stoneworking survived, astronomical observation survived, ritual survived, story survived, excess disappeared. This is why early post-catastrophe cultures often appear deceptively simple. In the archaeological record, simplicity is not always a sign of primitiveness. Sometimes it is the result of deliberate reduction. When everything can be lost, complexity becomes risk. And yet, memory continued to accumulate. Children grew up hearing stories they could not verify with their own experience. They were told of lands beneath the sea, of animals no longer seen, of skies that behaved differently than the ones above them. At first, these stories felt distant, then symbolic, then sacred. This is how history becomes myth without ever becoming false. As generations passed and the climate stabilized further, humans began once again to test permanence. They planted seeds not just as sustenance, but as statements. They said, "We believe we will still be here. We believe the seasons will return. We believe the ground will hold." Agriculture was not a sudden revolution. It was a cautious experiment repeated thousands of times across different landscapes. Some attempts failed, some succeeded. Those that succeeded reshaped everything. With stored food came denser populations. With denser populations came specialization. With specialization came hierarchy, planning, and long-term projects. Civilization did not appear suddenly. It reassembled itself slowly from fragments that had survived disaster. But memory never disappeared. It retreated into symbols, into ritual calendars, into architecture aligned not only with the land, but with the sky. When people marked solstices and equinoxes, they were not celebrating seasons alone. They were anchoring themselves to predictability itself. Predictability was safety, and this is why ancient gathering sites mattered even after agriculture took hold. They were not obsolete. They were reminders, anchors to a time when survival depended not on surplus, but on awareness. Over time, as societies grew more confident, memory became layered. New interpretations covered old meanings. Deities changed names. Stories absorbed moral lessons. The flood became a test of virtue in some traditions, a punishment in others, a cosmic reset in still others. But beneath every version, the structure remained unchanged. Water rose. The world ended. A few survived. Humanity began again. This consistency is not coincidence. It is the fingerprint of lived experience. Modern minds struggle with this idea because we expect history to be written. But writing is young. Memory is old. For most of human existence, survival depended on the accurate transmission of information through speech, ritual, and shared narrative. And when the information was critical enough, it was repeated endlessly. Do not build too low. Do not trust the sea. Remember the signs. Remember the sky. Remember that the earth can change. These messages did not require literacy. They required attention. This is why the flood myths persist across cultures that never contacted each other. Not because they copied a story, but because they inherited the same warning encoded in different symbolic systems. A Mesopotamian did not need to meet an Aboriginal elder to remember rising water. They both lived in a world reshaped by the same planetary event. Their stories diverged in detail but converged in structure because structure reflects reality. Reality leaves patterns. The Younger Dryas catastrophe, regardless of its precise trigger, was not a local anomaly. Its effects are visible on every continent. Ice returned suddenly. Ecosystems collapsed. Sea levels rose in pulses that drowned coastlines worldwide. Human populations contracted. Cultural continuity was threatened. And yet, humanity did not disappear. It adapted. And adaptation does not look heroic. It looks quiet. It looks like families moving inland. It looks like elders repeating stories until children can recite them without understanding why. It looks like monuments built not for beauty, but for memory. As millennia passed, these monuments became enigmatic, their builders forgotten, their original meanings obscured. Later civilizations stood among them and felt awe without context. Awe is the residue of memory without explanation. This is why later cultures often attributed such sites to gods or giants. When humans forget that humans can survive catastrophe, they imagine supernatural builders. It is easier than accepting that people like us once endured something we fear. And now, in the present, we stand in a strange position. We have more data than any civilization before us. We can measure ice thickness from space. We can model sea level rise decades into the future. We can identify feedback loops and tipping points with mathematical precision. And yet, emotionally, we are no different from our ancestors. We still live near the sea. We still trust stability. We still tell ourselves that change will be gradual enough to manage. The difference is not awareness. It is timing. Ancient survivors had no choice but to adapt immediately. Modern societies debate while thresholds approach. The catastrophe they remembered came suddenly. The one we face unfolds slowly, but inexorably. This makes it harder to perceive as danger. Water does not announce itself as apocalypse. It arrives as inconvenience, as flooding streets, as salt in wells, as insurance maps rewritten quietly, as neighborhoods abandoned not by panic, but by calculation. And calculation feels rational, not urgent. Yet the pattern remains the same. Coastlines retreat. People move inland. Memory begins to matter again. Perhaps this is why ancient stories resurface during times of change. Not because people become superstitious, but because deep memory recognizes familiar rhythms. We are not reliving the past, but we are rhyming with it. The survivors of the ancient flood understood something we struggle to accept, that the planet does not care about civilization. Civilization exists at the planet's discretion, not the other way around. This understanding did not make them nihilistic. It made them adaptive. They did not seek to dominate nature. They sought to understand its moods. They watched the sky. They watched the water. They listened to elders who remembered what happened when patterns broke. And they preserved that listening in ways that could outlast language. Stone, story, ritual. These were not expressions of ignorance. They were technologies of survival. As sleep approaches, allow this perspective to settle without anxiety. The purpose of memory is not fear. It is continuity. The ancient builders did not want their descendants to panic. They wanted them to remember that survival is possible, but not automatic. The flood did not end humanity. Forgetting merely could have. And perhaps that is the quiet warning embedded in stone and myth alike. Not that disaster will come, but that when it does, memory will determine what survives. Let the images slow now. Let the world become quiet again. Imagine the land after the waters receded. Not empty, but changed. Not destroyed, but rewritten. Imagine people standing on high ground at dusk, watching a horizon that no longer matches their childhood memories, and choosing, still, to live. That choice is the beginning of every civilization. And so civilization resumed its long experiment with permanence, carrying within it a memory older than writing, older than cities, older even than agriculture itself. A memory not stored in books or laws, but in instinct. A quiet understanding that the world can change faster than beliefs, and that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most attentive. Over generations, this instinct softened. Children born long after the flood listened to the stories with curiosity rather than fear. The drowned lands became places of imagination, not mourning. The catastrophe retreated further into the past, becoming less immediate, more symbolic, more mythic. And as it did, confidence slowly returned. Humans began to build again with ambition. They raised walls. They marked borders. They declared ownership over land that had once belonged to the sea. They named rivers and believed those names would endure. They constructed calendars that assumed the seasons would behave. And for a long time, they were right. Stability, when it lasts long enough, feels permanent. The climate entered a narrow window of calm that allowed complex societies to flourish. Cities grew. Trade networks stretched across continents. Knowledge accumulated faster than it was lost. Writing preserved memory externally, freeing the mind for invention. This period, brief by geological standards but vast by human ones, reshaped the species. It created the illusion that humanity had mastered its environment. That catastrophe belonged to the past, sealed in myth and stone, safely distant. But memory never vanished entirely. It lingered at the edges of culture, in flood festivals, in purification rituals, in stories told to children about respect for water, for storms, for the sky. Even as societies grew more sophisticated, they continued to reenact the end of the world symbolically, as if reminding themselves that creation and destruction were never fully separate. Ritual is memory in motion. When ancient peoples reenacted floods in ceremony, when they poured water, submerged effigies, cleansed temples, they were not celebrating destruction. They were acknowledging a truth that rational planning alone cannot contain. That stability is conditional. The earth grants it, and the earth can withdraw it. This understanding did not make ancient civilizations fragile. It made them resilient. Many early cities were built with abandonment in mind. Materials were reused, settlements shifted, sacred sites endured even when populations moved. Contrast this with modern civilization, which builds as if retreat is failure rather than adaptation. We fortify coastlines. We drain wetlands. We hold land in place with concrete and steel, believing resistance is the same as control. But water has always been patient. It does not need to overwhelm all at once. It needs only to rise enough to change the rules. And that is what the ancient survivors understood. The flood they endured was not a single moment, but a long unraveling punctuated by violence. Coastlines did not vanish overnight. They retreated season by season, generation by generation, until what had once been familiar became legend. This is why flood myths often speak of prolonged rains, extended darkness, long journeys. They are not exaggerations. They are compressions of lived time. Imagine watching the sea move closer every year. Imagine relocating again and again, carrying fewer possessions each time. Imagine elders pointing toward the water and saying, "That was once land," while children see only waves. At some point, disbelief gives way to acceptance. And acceptance is where culture changes. The flood did not only reshape geography, it reshaped consciousness. It taught humanity that the world is dynamic, that loss is possible on scales beyond personal tragedy, and that survival requires flexibility not only in body, but in thought. This lesson was encoded into language itself. Words for renewal, cleansing, rebirth appear again and again across cultures, not because people enjoyed destruction, but because destruction forced renewal. The flood was not the end of humanity's story. It was a transition, and transitions leave marks. Even now, long after the physical waters receded, those marks persist in the way humans respond to environmental threat. We feel a particular anxiety around rising seas that we do not feel around other dangers. Flood imagery dominates our nightmares and our apocalyptic fiction. The idea of drowning cities carries a weight disproportionate to its frequency. This is not coincidence, it is inheritance. We carry within us the memory of a time when water erased the world we knew. Not consciously, not as data, but as intuition. And intuition does not argue, it recognizes. As modern science reconstructs the past with increasing precision, it begins to confirm what stories never forgot. That the end of the last ice age was not smooth, that warming did not proceed gently, that massive floods reshaped continents and coastlines. Satellite imagery reveals ancient river channels beneath deserts. Sonar maps expose drowned valleys beneath the sea. Ice cores preserve abrupt shifts that no gradualist model can fully explain away. The planet bears scars. Humanity bears stories. Together, they tell the same narrative from different perspectives. The debate over causes will continue. Science thrives on uncertainty, but uncertainty about cause does not erase certainty about effect. Something destabilized the climate system. Something unleashed water on a scale humanity had never experienced before. Something forced survival to become the central concern of an entire species. And yet, humanity endured, not because it was prepared, but because it was adaptable. This is the quality that monuments like the ancient hilltop sanctuary celebrate without naming. They are not triumphalist. They are not proclamations of dominance. They are acknowledgments of survival against forces far larger than human intention. They say, quietly, we were here before. We endured. We learned. And they trust that learning to time. Today, we stand at another threshold, not identical to the past, but familiar in structure. Climate systems shift, sea levels rise, feedback loops accelerate, coastal populations grow uneasy. Inland migration begins not as panic, but as planning. History does not repeat, but it remembers. And memory expresses itself not as prophecy, but as pattern. The ancient flood myths are not warnings of divine punishment. They are records of planetary behavior translated into human meaning. They remind us that the Earth operates on scales and timelines that do not prioritize civilization. This does not make civilization futile, it makes it fragile. Fragility is not weakness. It is a condition that demands care. The survivors of the ancient catastrophe understood this. They did not believe they could prevent disaster forever. They believed they could survive it if they paid attention. Attention is the true inheritance. Attention to water, attention to land, attention to memory. As you listen now, as the pace of thought slows and the mind drifts toward rest, allow this understanding to settle gently rather than urgently. The purpose of remembering is not fear. It is humility. The stones were not built to scare the future. They were built to steady it. They say, you are not alone in facing change. They say, others stood where you stand. They say, survival is possible. The flood did not end the human story. It deepened it. And deep stories do not shout. They whisper. They whisper through ritual, through myth, through archaeology, through intuition. They whisper that water is powerful, that memory matters, and that adaptation is the oldest human skill. Let these thoughts slow now. Let the images soften. Imagine the sea at dusk, calm, reflective, holding beneath it landscapes that once fed families and carried footsteps, not as loss, but as archive, a record of where humanity has been. Imagine the land inland, rising gently, offering refuge without drama. High ground not as escape, but as continuity. And imagine people, ancient and modern, linked by the same quiet decision. To move, to adapt, to remember. This is not the end of the story. It never was. The flood ended long ago. But its lesson remains. And as long as humanity remembers, the story continues. There is a moment, late in every long human story, when the past stops feeling distant and begins to feel familiar. Not because the details return, but because the pattern reveals itself. The ancient survivors did not know the future, but they understood cycles. They understood that the world does not move toward safety or danger permanently. It oscillates, it breathes, it tightens and releases, and humanity breathes with it. For thousands of years after the flood, people lived inside this understanding without naming it. They did not speak of climate systems or thresholds, but they recognized instability when they felt it. They watched animals behave differently. They noticed changes in wind, in rain, in the way seasons hesitated or arrived too early. Observation was not a science. It was survival. As societies grew more complex, observation became distributed. No single person carried the whole picture anymore. Knowledge fragmented into professions, roles, hierarchies. Farmers watched the soil. Sailors watched the sea. Priests watched the sky. Elders watched memory. Each held a piece of the truth, but fewer held the whole. This fragmentation brought power and vulnerability at the same time. Power, because specialization allows precision. Vulnerability, because specialization can forget context. The ancient flood was remembered precisely because it was total. It affected everyone. There was no profession untouched by it, no role that could remain neutral. When water rises to the mountains, there is no outside. That is why the memory endured so deeply. It was shared trauma, shared survival. In the modern world, change arrives unevenly. One city floods while another remains dry. One coast erodes while another is fortified. One generation feels urgency while another debates probability. Fragmentation dulls perception. And yet, beneath fragmentation, the old instinct stirs. When people watch footage of cities flooding, something ancient responds. When maps show coastlines retreating, the reaction is not purely intellectual. It is visceral. The body recognizes a threat older than language. This recognition does not demand panic. It demands orientation. The ancient builders oriented themselves toward high ground, not because they rejected the lowlands forever, but because they understood sequencing. First survive, then rebuild, then remember. Modern civilization often reverses this order. It rebuilds first, remembers later, and struggles to survive what it refuses to imagine. The monuments left by survivors were not blueprints. They were anchors. They did not tell future generations exactly what to do. They reminded them how to think, slowly, collectively, with humility. Humility is the most misunderstood inheritance from catastrophe. It is often mistaken for weakness. In reality, it is strategic clarity. It recognizes limits before they are enforced. The survivors of the ancient flood did not believe humanity was small. They believed nature was vast. Those two beliefs can coexist without contradiction. When they buried their sanctuary, They were not hiding from the future. They were preparing for it. They understood that some knowledge must rest until the moment arrives when it can be received, without distortion. Too early, and it is ignored. Too late, and it is lost. Timing is everything. Perhaps that is why these monuments re-emerge now, in an age when humanity once again stands at a threshold. Not the same threshold, but a familiar one. A point where gradual change begins to accelerate, where long-term trends start producing short-term consequences. Sea level rise does not feel dramatic until it intersects with daily life, until roads flood, until insurance disappears, until migration becomes personal rather than theoretical. This is how catastrophe always announces itself, quietly, then persistently. The ancient survivors knew this rhythm. They experienced it without graphs or projections. They felt it in their feet as the shoreline moved, in their lungs as damp air traveled farther inland, in their sleep as familiar landmarks disappeared. They did not need certainty to act. They needed awareness. Awareness is what monuments cultivate across time. Not information, but attention. The stones do not explain. They invite contemplation. They slow the mind. They demand presence. This is why they are effective across millennia. They do not argue with the future. They wait for it. As sleep deepens, as the modern world loosens its grip, the mind becomes more receptive to patterns than to data. This is not regression. It is integration. The conscious mind rests. The deeper mind listens. And the deeper mind remembers. It remembers that water is both giver and taker. It remembers that stability is precious because it is temporary. It remembers that survival is not guaranteed, but possible. The flood myths endure not because humans are obsessed with destruction, but because they are committed to continuity. They tell the story again and again until it becomes impossible to fully forget. And forgetting, more than catastrophe, is what ends civilizations. Civilizations rarely collapse because the environment changes. They collapse because they refuse to adapt to that change in time. They cling to old assumptions long after the conditions that supported them have shifted. The ancient survivors adapted because they had no alternative. Their world forced clarity upon them. The modern world offers delay. Delay is seductive. Delay feels rational. Delay feels safe, until it isn't. This is not prophecy. It is pattern recognition. The flood ended once. It reshaped everything. Humanity continued. That continuation was not accidental. It was the result of shared memory, shared action, and the willingness to move when movement was required. As this final part unfolds, as the story slows further, becoming almost weightless, let the lesson rest gently rather than urgently. This is not a call to fear. It is an invitation to remember that humans have faced planetary change before and remained human. The past does not ask us to repeat it. It asks us to learn from it. The stones remain because stone is patient. The sea remains because water is relentless. Memory remains because survival depends on it. And now, as generations before trusted, memory passes quietly forward again. The patience of water is not passive. It is deliberate. It moves according to laws that do not announce themselves. And it reshapes the world without urgency. Mountains rise and erode. Ice advances and retreats. Seas expand and contract. And within this slow choreography, human lives flicker briefly, building meaning wherever stability allows. The ancient survivors did not imagine themselves as masters of this process. They understood themselves as participants. Their monuments were not declarations of victory over nature, but acknowledgments of coexistence with forces far older and far larger than any society. This understanding shaped how they imagined time. Time was not a straight line moving toward improvement. It was a cycle of abundance and loss, growth and retreat. To survive meant to recognize where one stood within that cycle, not to deny its existence. This is why memory mattered more than innovation in the aftermath of catastrophe. Innovation could rebuild tools. Memory rebuilt judgment. Judgment told people when to move. Judgment told them where not to settle. Judgment told them which patterns to trust and which to treat with caution. Without judgment, technology becomes fragile. As centuries passed and the trauma of the flood receded further into myth, humanity's relationship with memory changed again. The stories remained, but their emotional weight softened. They became moral lessons, theological explanations, symbolic dramas. The flood was no longer felt as lived danger. It became something that happened once, long ago, safely concluded. This is always the most dangerous moment in any long recovery. When catastrophe becomes distant enough to feel abstract, its lessons risk being reinterpreted as allegory rather than experience. What was once a warning becomes a metaphor. What was once a survival guide becomes a story told for tradition alone. The ancient builders anticipated this. They did not rely on narrative alone. They embedded memory into place. They chose locations that demanded attention, that could not be fully absorbed into daily life. High ground, stone, isolation, places you had to travel to, places you could not casually repurpose, places that interrupted routine. By doing so, they ensured that memory would never become completely comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of awareness. As civilizations matured, they built their own systems of comfort. Roads smooth movement, architecture softened climate, storage buffered scarcity. Over time, these systems created the impression that humans had escaped the vulnerability of earlier ages. But vulnerability does not disappear. It changes form. The ancient flood struck suddenly. The modern one advances slowly. Slow change is harder to perceive, harder to rally against, harder to respond to collectively. It does not trigger survival instincts immediately. It invites debate, delay, optimization. It allows societies to postpone adaptation while reinforcing the belief that there is still time. And sometimes there is, but sometimes there is not. The ancient survivors did not have the luxury of delay. They responded because the ground beneath them forced response. Their memory became sharp because the consequences were immediate. Today, the consequences accumulate gradually, revealing themselves unevenly across regions and generations. This fragmentation dulls urgency. One city adapts while another resists. One coastline retreats while another builds higher walls. The shared experience that once unified response is missing. And yet, beneath this fragmentation, the old recognition remains. When people speak of rising seas, the fear they express is not entirely rational or contemporary. It carries something older, a recognition that water, once unleashed, does not negotiate. This is why the flood myths feel strangely relevant even now. They do not describe our situation precisely, but they describe our relationship to change. They remind us that stability is borrowed, not owned. Borrowed from climate, borrowed from geography, borrowed from time. The ancient survivors built knowing the loan could be called in. That knowledge shaped their values. They emphasized continuity over expansion, memory over excess, adaptation over permanence. These values are not incompatible with civilization. They are its stabilizers. When civilization forgets them, it becomes brittle. Brittleness does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when stress arrives. Under pressure, systems that cannot bend break suddenly. The ancient flood was such a stress test. Many human systems failed. Humanity itself did not. This distinction matters. Civilizations can collapse without humanity disappearing. Cultures can vanish while the species continues. The ancient survivors understood this intuitively. Their loyalty was not to a specific way of life, but to life itself. This is why their monuments do not glorify kings, victories, or conquest. They commemorate endurance. They say, "We are still here." And that message, carved into stone, remains accessible to any future that pauses long enough to listen. As the modern world accelerates, pauses become rare. Attention fragments. Time compresses. Memory competes with novelty. In such conditions, ancient messages risk being overlooked not because they are irrelevant, but because they are quiet. Quiet truths are easy to ignore in loud civilizations. And yet, sleep restores the capacity to hear them. When the mind slows, when urgency fades, when thought releases its grip, deeper patterns emerge. This is why stories meant for sleep have always existed, not to entertain, but to integrate. They allow memory to bypass resistance. They speak to the part of the mind that recognizes continuity without analysis. As this story continues, as the rhythm softens further, let the images become less specific and more archetypal. Not places, but sensations. Not events, but movements. Water rising, people moving, stone waiting. These movements are older than history. They will outlast it. The ancient flood was not the end of a world. It was a transformation. The world did not disappear. It changed form. Humanity did not end. It reorganized. This is the most important lesson the survivors left behind. Change does not equal extinction, but refusal to adapt might. The monuments do not demand that we fear the future. They invite us to respect it, to recognize that long-term stability requires humility and foresight, not dominance. They remind us that humanity's greatest strength is not its ability to control, but its ability to respond. Response requires awareness. Awareness requires memory. Memory requires attention. And attention begins with listening. Listening to the land. Listening to the water. Listening to the stories that have outlived their tellers. The ancient survivors trusted that one day, someone would listen again. that the message would surface when it was needed most, not when it was easiest to hear. Perhaps that day is not singular. Perhaps it unfolds slowly, generation by generation, as awareness spreads unevenly but persistently. Perhaps the story does not end with warning or resolution, but with continuity. Humanity has faced planetary change before. Humanity has adapted before. Humanity can do so again. This is not optimism, it is precedent. As the final minutes of this long story approach, let the pace become even gentler. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to persuade, only something left to remember. The stones remain because they were placed with patience. The sea remains because it follows its nature. And humanity remains because it remembers when remembering matters. Sleep now, carrying this memory lightly, not as burden, but as inheritance, the kind that steadies rather than weighs down. The flood ended long ago. Its lesson did not. And as long as that lesson is carried forward quietly, carefully, across generations, the story continues, not loudly, not dramatically, but enduring. And continuity is the quiet victory of survival. Long after the idea of catastrophe fades from conscious thought, its influence remains embedded in choices that feel natural rather than deliberate. Humanity does not remember the flood as an event. Humanity remembers it as orientation, as a subtle preference for safety over certainty, for flexibility over rigidity, for movement over attachment when conditions begin to shift. This orientation shaped how people imagined home. A home was not a structure meant to last forever. It was a shelter designed to endure long enough to raise children, long enough to pass knowledge, long enough to remain ready to move again. Stone was used not because it promised permanence, but because it promised stability within change. Stone could be abandoned and still remain. Wood could be rebuilt. Earth could be reshaped. The materials themselves reflected an understanding that nothing human-made was immune to time. And time, after catastrophe, was no longer trusted blindly. The ancient survivors did not assume tomorrow would resemble today. They assumed only that change would continue. This assumption did not lead to despair. It led to preparedness, to redundancy, to shared responsibility. When one group moved, others knew where they went. When one place failed, another was remembered. When resources dwindled, stories guided relocation. Memory became infrastructure. This is a form of intelligence rarely acknowledged by modern systems, because it cannot be centralized or quantified easily. It exists between people, not within institutions. It travels through narrative, ritual, and habit rather than command. Civilizations built upon such memory were resilient even when fragile. They could fracture and reform. They could lose cities without losing identity. They could migrate without forgetting who they were. The flood forced this flexibility into humanity at a foundational level. Over time, as stability returned, this flexibility softened. Humans began to invest more deeply in specific places. Architecture grew heavier. Borders hardened. Permanence became a goal rather than a temporary condition. This shift was not a mistake. It was an experiment. Every civilization experiments with permanence. Some succeed for centuries. Some fail quickly. None succeed forever. The ancient survivors understood this without bitterness. Their myths do not promise eternal kingdoms. They promise renewal after loss. The difference is profound. An eternal kingdom denies change. Renewal accepts it. This acceptance is what allowed memory to persist without becoming paralysis. When people believe loss is impossible, they resist adaptation. When people believe loss is inevitable, they prepare for continuity instead. The flood myths occupy a delicate balance between these extremes. They acknowledge devastation without surrendering hope. They describe destruction without worshiping it. They center survival without glorifying suffering. This balance is why they endure. Modern narratives often fail here. They swing between denial and doom, between control and collapse. Ancient narratives inhabit the middle space where attention replaces certainty. Attention is not anxiety. It is presence. Presence allows response. As millennia passed and human societies became increasingly complex, the memory of catastrophe became layered beneath progress. Technologies emerged that distanced daily life from environmental feedback. Heating, storage, transportation, abstraction. These innovations were not errors. They were triumphs. But triumph can create blindness when it forgets its origins. The ancient survivors never forgot that their ancestors once watched the world drown. That knowledge did not limit ambition. It contextualized it. They built, but they built with awareness. They expanded, but they remembered retreat. They prospered, but they honored restraint. This ethos did not disappear overnight. It eroded gradually as generations lived farther from the experience that forged it. Erosion is slow. It is gentle. It feels like normality. This is why civilizations often collapse without recognizing the moment danger becomes irreversible. The signals were present, but they felt familiar rather than urgent. Change arrived disguised as continuity. The ancient flood arrived differently. It shattered familiarity. It forced clarity. Today's changes arrive incrementally. They invite negotiation rather than demand it. This makes ancient memory more relevant, not less. The survivors did not wait for perfect information. They acted when patterns shifted. They trusted observation over prediction. They valued collective movement over individual optimization. These are not primitive strategies. They are adaptive ones. The monuments they left behind do not instruct us to replicate their lives. They invite us to remember how they thought. Slowly, collectively, with humility. The buried sanctuary was not meant to be excavated quickly or easily. It was meant to resist casual access. Only a future with sufficient curiosity, patience, and technical capacity would uncover it. This is not coincidence. It is a filter. The message waits for minds capable of receiving it without distortion. Minds willing to listen rather than conquer. Minds open to continuity rather than dominance. As we uncover these places now, we often ask the wrong question first. We ask, how could they build this? A better question is, why did they preserve this? Preservation implies intent beyond immediate utility. It implies foresight. It implies trust in a future they would never witness. Trust is not naive when it is grounded in experience. The ancient survivors trusted that humanity would continue, not because it deserved to, but because it had already proven capable of adaptation under extreme pressure. That proof was not theoretical. It was lived. This is why the flood is remembered not as extinction, but as transformation. Humanity did not vanish. It reorganized. Transformation is unsettling because it does not guarantee familiarity. It only guarantees continuation. The modern world resists transformation because it threatens identity tied to place, infrastructure, and growth. Ancient societies tied identity to continuity of people and memory rather than to fixed geography. This difference matters. When geography shifts, identities tied to land fracture. Identities tied to story migrate intact. This is why oral cultures survived displacements that destroyed cities. Their infrastructure was carried within them. The flood taught this lesson brutally. And so, as we approach the deepest layers of this story, the message simplifies rather than intensifies. Complexity fades. Only essentials remain. Water changes the world. Humanity adapts or it does not. Memory determines which outcome prevails. The stones remain not because they are indestructible, but because they were placed with patience and intention. They waited through centuries of neglect, misunderstanding, and silence until the conditions for listening returned. Listening is the final act of survival, not reacting, not dominating, not predicting perfectly. Listening to land that shifts, listening to water that rises, listening to stories older than nations. This listening does not require fear, it requires stillness. Sleep provides that stillness. As the story continues to unfold quietly, allow the modern world to recede. Let the mind drift toward the rhythm that predates clocks, toward tides, toward seasons, toward cycles that do not hurry. In that rhythm, catastrophe is not an anomaly. It is a phase, not welcomed, not worshipped, but understood. Understanding removes panic. The ancient survivors did not panic endlessly. They mourned, they adapted, they remembered, then they lived. That is the true ending of the flood story. Not destruction, not warning, but continuation. And continuation is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is patient. It is human. The sea will continue to move. The land will continue to shift. And humanity will continue to choose how it responds. The stones remain as witnesses, not judges. The stories remain as guides, not commands. And memory, passed gently from one generation to the next, continues its work beneath awareness. The flood ended. The lesson did not. And as long as the lesson is carried softly, without urgency, without fear, the story never truly ends. It simply